So fellas, this weekend we've got UFC Seattle, Henry Cejudo coming back to take on Song Yadong, and it's a really good fight night card. There's been a bunch of pullouts and fights that have fallen through on this card, but overall from top to bottom for a fight night, it's still a really good card with a bunch of good fights. It is quite a short card, but either way, as always, we're going to be breaking down every fighter on this card and leaving my own personal predictions. I've been doing decent with the predictions recently, so hopefully we can keep that up, and we'll go in there with the first fight. We've got Modestas Bukauskas taking on Raffael Cerqueira. Modestas Bukauskas before the UFC had a bit of an up and down career, but was mainly doing well in Cage Warriors, managed to become a multiple-time Cage Warriors champion. Comes over to the UFC, gets a good finish in his UFC debut. Then he ends up getting finished by Jimmy Crute, loses to Mcconico, ends up getting at his leg absolutely stomped on in one of the most brutal stoppage losses by Khalil Roundtree. The UFC decides to cut him. He becomes Cage Warriors champion again, gets another UFC contract, and right now he's 3-1 in his last 4 fights, and he's currently training with Tom Aspinall with the heavyweight gym, so he's had a really good gym for light heavyweights. Taking on Raffael Cerqueira, who had a really good, promising start to his MMA career, a bunch of stoppages, comes in against Ibo Aslan at UFC 308 and gets absolutely bum-rushed in the first round against Ibo Aslan. So I'm going to be going with Modestas Bukauskas to win this fight. It's hard to say how good Raffael Cerqueira is because the one time we've seen him in the UFC, he's been completely bum-rushed. My only worry in this fight is that Modestas Bukauskas is very defensively, well, he's just not defensively sound. He gets caught a lot, and you put him in against somebody who I still don't really know if he's dangerous or not, but at least has some sort of power in Raffael Cerqueira. But I'm kind of bought on the skill of Modestas Bukauskas. The fight IQ and the defense might not be there, but from a defensive skills perspective, Modestas Bukauskas does look pretty skilled. And like I said before, he's training at a good gym. I know the gym can't fight for you or anything, but he seems to have done a lot better on this second UFC run. He impressed me in that fight against Tyson Pedro, who's another heavy grappler. Raffael Cerqueira, I'm not sure if he's UFC worthy. He didn't really look like he wanted to be there against Ibo Aslan, had absolutely nothing to offer, so I'm going to go with Modestas Bukauskas to get a decision win. I still think there's a small chance that Cerqueira could hit him with something big, because knowing Modestas Bukauskas, he's the type of guy to get hit by something big and finish because he's such a goofy kind of striker. But I think from a skills perspective, he's better than Cerqueira. So I'm going to go with Modestas Bukauskas, the guy who's UFC worthy, proven in the UFC to win this fight by decision. Then we have Mansur Abdul Malik with his, I think, second UFC fight, taking on Nick Klein from the Contender Series. Malik, this guy's a very dangerous fella. 7 wins. All of those wins coming by way of stoppage, and 6 of them in the very first round. Starts off his MMA career with a bunch of first-round stoppages, with an average fight time of like 1 minute. Gets another stoppage on the Contender Series, and in his most recent fight, absolutely destroyed Todorovic in his UFC debut, doing exactly what we expected him to do. In terms of Nick Klein, he's also had a pretty solid start to his MMA career. A lot of stoppages. He did get finished at one point, but he had, quite a bit of stoppages. And on the Contender Series, he just recently got a submission win. I'm going to go in with Mansur Abdul Malik to win this one by finish in the first round. I think he's one of the better prospects that have come from the Contender Series, is Abdul Malik. Again, he trains at a good gym, but most importantly, his performances are always showing up, and we know that he's UFC worthy. He went against Todorovic, a guy who's been experienced in the UFC, and he just completely mauled him. He's got vicious ground and pounders, Abdul Malik. He likes to take the fight to the mat with his wrestling and absolutely destroy people with ground and pound. He hits very hard, very explosive guy, and it's not even just the wrestling and the grappling as well. Even his stand-up, he's a very heavy-handed guy, but I think he's going to take down Nick Klein and absolutely destroy him with the grappling, and that's the key to victory as well for Nick Klein. He's not really the most sharp striker. He likes to take the fight to the mat and look for submissions, does Nick Klein, and doing that against Mansur Abdul Malik is only going to get you even in worse positions. So I think this is a good fight for Abdul Malik. I think they've kind of given him a guy from the Contender Series to hopefully build the name of Malik and get him in front of a crowd. I'm going Malik KO in the first round. Like I said, he's a good prospect, very good wrestler, very dangerous as well, BC grappler, and I can't wait to see more from him, and this just seems like a bit of a step up for Abdul Malik. I think he gets this one done by finish in the first round. Then we have Ricky Simon, former prospect turned into a bit of a journeyman, taking on Javid Basharat. You've got Ricky Simon, who, like I said before, was a bit of a prospect, had a promising career outside of the UFC, comes over to the Contender Series, gets a split decision, ends up not actually getting a UFC contract, so he has to go back to LFA, becomes a champion in LFA. Then he debuts against Merab, actually ends up choking out Merab out cold, so this is probably one of the best aged wins in the UFC right now. I mean, choking out Merab. Then after that, he goes on another 2-fight winning streak, beating Montel Jackson, who's also now ranked in the UFC. Then he loses 2 fights to Rob Font at Uriah Faber, but goes on a bit of a tear with quite a few stoppages, finishing Jack Show, which was a really good win. And now he's on a 3-fight losing streak, getting finished by Song Yadong and losing to Vinicius Oliveira and Mario Batista. He's going to be taking on Javid Basharat, who's obviously one half of the Basharat brothers. Outside of the UFC, Basharat was just tearing up the place, absolutely destroying everyone. A bunch of stoppages outside the UFC, majority of them being in the first round. Gets another stoppage on the Contender Series, ends up going on a 3-fight decision streak in the UFC. Not so much the stoppages, but still managed to go on a 3-fight winning streak. Ends up having a no contest against Victor Henry, where he absolutely booted his balls off, and then he ends up fighting Ayman Zahabi, where he lost a fairly close decision, but he definitely lost that fight. But yeah, in his most recent fight, he did lose to Ayman Zahabi, who's now ranked in the bantamweight division. In terms of who I think is going to win this fight, I'm going to be going with Javid Basharat to win this one by decision. I know they kind of have a grappling style. Javid Basharat's a really good offensive wrestler. Ricky Simon has more of a jiu-jitsu style. But Ricky Simon, first of all, doesn't really tend to take the fight to the mat. Like, he's kind of turned into a pressure boxer nowadays. Even despite him being a grappler, Ricky Simon isn't the type of guy who likes to take people down constantly. And I feel like Javid Basharat is going to have enough, grappling to keep the fight on the feet. And when it comes to the stand-up between the two of them, it seems like every single time we see Ricky Simon nowadays, he's a bit of a punching bag. I know he's facing guys like Vinicius Oliveira, who we know has good striking, but just in general, Ricky Simon never really looks good with the stand-up, but he's against Javid Basharat, and Javid Basharat isn't an elite striker, but he's definitely the more technical out of the two of them, and I think he's going to have a decent time piecing up Ricky Simon, because even in that fight with Ayman Zahabi, Javid Basharat was finding the mark. So I'm going to be going with Javid Basharat to win this one by decision, unanimous decision, keeps the fight standing, and just simply pieces up Ricky Simon. I feel like Ricky Simon's massively fallen off. He doesn't really use the grappling to his advantage. I think he shot like 2 takedowns in the entire fight against Vinicius Oliveira. And I think even if he wanted to take the fight to the mat, he's going to have a hard time doing that against Javid Basharat. And from what I've seen, Basharat's the better striker. Simon, he has this very heavy pressure boxing style. Hasn't been working for him. I'm going to go Javid Basharat to get the decision win in this fight. And then we've got Nursulton Ruziboev on short notice against Eric Mcconico. I think that's how you say his name. I don't even know who this Mcconico. I couldn't even find a proper picture of Mcconico, which is why he's not even in like a PNG format. But we've got Ruziboev taking on Mcconico. This Mcconico guy, he's had a pretty solid career outside of the UFC. A couple of losses. He's fought in LFA a few times. He actually ended up fighting a former UFC fighter and having a good stoppage over him, but the guy who he ended up fighting in the UFC was by no means elite. Going to be taking on Nursulton Ruziboev, who has one of the biggest MMA careers outside of the UFC. This guy has basically had multiple careers outside of the UFC. So his UFC career is only just starting, but he's been outside on the regional scene for so long. Fought on short notice against Bruno Ferreira and got a massive KO victory over Bruno Ferreira, which is aged like wine. Then in his next fight, takes on Cedric Damas, finishes a bit of a controversial stoppage because there was an eye poke, but he ends up getting a finish over Cedric Damas. And then in his third fight, takes on Joaquin Buckley at 170, which is still mind-boggling how a 170-pounder, well, a 6'4" guy is fighting at 170-pounder. He was way too skinny for that division, way too drained. He was absolutely huge for the division. Ends up losing a decision to Joaquin Buckley, where he didn't really look that good in that fight. The performance was a bit off. But to be fair to Nursulton Ruziboev, compared to the recent guys Buckley's been facing, he's probably looked better than a lot of them as well. He didn't really, he didn't get stopped in that fight. He didn't look like he was ever at threat of getting finished. But either way, yeah, I'm going Ruziboev to knock out Mcconico in this fight. Ruziboev, very tall, rangy, and powerful striker. He's very good at finding the mark. He's Ruziboev. Rangy, uses it to his advantage, and I think he's going to clip Mcconico, who I've looked at Mcconico, and despite him being quite a quick striker, he is very hittable. There's nothing that shows me that Mcconico is the next big thing or this big underdog prospect that he can possibly pick. So I'm going to go with Ruziboev to knock him out in the first round. Good, tall, rangy, and dangerous striker is Ruziboev. I think he's actually a good prospect for the middleweight division. Despite losing to Buckley, like I said, it was on short notice, and that was when he was completely drained. And look how Buckley's doing nowadays. The UFC have made this fight so they can bring in Mcconico. They don't have to pay him that much money. They can get a free fight on without having to pay that much, and they can just showcase Ruziboev, in my opinion. Massive layup for Ruziboev on short notice, and I think he stops him in the first round. Then we've got Cutelaba versus Ibo Aslan. I'm actually looking forward to this fight. I'm interested to see how the face-off goes, because obviously we've got Cutelaba, who's kind of known more for his face-offs than his in-octagon performances. He's dressing out as Hulk. He's getting in people's faces at the weigh-ins and stuff. So I'm excited to see how Ibo Aslan handles that, because Ibo Aslan's also one of these kind of intense stare-down type of guys. But anyway, outside of the UFC, comes into the UFC on a winning streak. There's Cutelaba with a bunch of first-round stoppages, and he's just essentially been a massive win-loss fighter in the UFC. Every single time you think he's about to get cut from the UFC, he picks up a win to keep his contract, then goes on another losing streak, and then picks up a win to keep his contract, and then goes on a losing streak. But to be fair, you look at some of the names he's losing to. He lost to Cannonier when he was at 205. He lost to Glover Teixeira, Ankalaev, Johnny Walker, Ryan Spann, Kennedy Nzechukwu. So he's not losing to cans. He's losing to fairly well-known names, but He is coming off, I mean, yeah, he's not really been able to fight any or beat any of the top guys in this division. He has beaten Khalil Roundtree before, though, which is something notable. He actually managed to finish Khalil Roundtree, and in his most recent fight, he did beat Ibo Aslan, a UFC debutant, by split decision. I thought he should have been unanimous, but he beat him by split decision. They're going to be taking on, Cutelaba, going to be taking on Ibo Aslan, who's massive in Turkey. This guy's a massive Turkish star, over 300,000 followers on Instagram. Dustin Poirier's Twitter account got hacked a couple of weeks ago, and the hacker ended up pinning an edit of Ibo Aslan. So the Turkish people are massively behind this guy. I think they think he's going to be the next big thing from Turkey. And to be fair, you look at his record, 14-1. Every single one of those wins coming by way of knockout, and most of them being in the very first round as well. He had a very solid career outside of the UFC. Ended up losing to Anton Tolkaj. Comes on the Contender Series, gets a stoppage. And then in his next fight, beats Tolkaj, the guy that he actually ended up losing to. So he's never lost a fight and then not been able to beat them in the future. So the one guy that he lost to, he ended up beating in the UFC. And then in his most recent fight, like I said, absolutely bum-rushed Raffael Cerqueira in 50 seconds. This isn't an easy fight for Ibo Aslan. I don't think he should be the heavy favourite, but it's not necessarily an easy fight. I'm going to be picking him to win this one by knockout in the first round, but there's still a chance that Ian Cutelaba, being the guy who's experienced in the UFC, could potentially take down Ibo Aslan and take the fight to the mat, which we've seen Aslan kind of struggle with before in former UFC fights. But I can't trust Ian Cutelaba, who's been knocked out so many times in the UFC. His chin has been tested, and it's not passed the test so many times against a guy as powerful and as dangerous on the feet in Ibo Aslan. I think Ibo Aslan finds the shot at some point in the fight. I think he goes in there in the first round. I don't think it's going to be another 50-second bum rush. And we might have been seeing Ian Cutelaba land a big shot too, because as terrible as Cutelaba is, I will say the guy is a ferocious striker. He's got decent wrestling. If he has a good game plan coming into this fight and Ibo Aslan underestimates him, I think Ian Cutelaba could find a key to victory. But I just think Ibo Aslan is going to land on the button for Ian Cutelaba. The guy's been knocked out way too many times, and I think this is a terrible matchup. I did say the same thing about Aslan in his last fight, because Aslan was a dangerous striker too, but at least Ibo Aslan has actually proven himself to be UFC worthy. Knocked out Cerqueira. Looks like a heavy-handed guy. I'm going Ibo Aslan to get the stoppage in the first round. Then he's probably one of the better light heavyweight prospects as well. He's Ibo Aslan, whereas Ian Cutelaba, the guy's fighting just to save his contract. I think if he loses this fight, he might get cut from the UFC. So Ibo Aslan by a stoppage in the first round. Then we've got Touchy Fili taking on Melquizael Costa. You've got Andre Fili, who's a complete veteran of the UFC. This guy's been in the UFC for so long. Ended up fighting against Jeremy Lawson back in the day, all the way back in 2013. So this guy's a complete veteran to the UFC. And even though he's lost a lot of times and he is a bit of a win-loss fighter in the UFC, he's one of these guys that he loses to notable names. Like, you look at most of his losses: Max Holloway, Yair Rodriguez, Bryce Mitchell, Ige, Keita, Youssef, Johnson, Anderson Brito. He's losing to cans. He's losing to elite fighters, or at least top-level fighters at the time of fighting them. And he's a pretty dangerous striker as well. He's a very dangerous guy, likes to go out there and throw it out there. He's a dangerous striker, but also very vulnerable too. He hasn't got the best chin for his fighting style, but he's a bit of a chaotic striker. He's coming off a win over Cub Swanson, which was quite impressive at UFC 303. Going to be taking on Melquizael Costa, who has one of the most even records I've seen. 33% of his wins by knockout, 33% by submission, 33% by decision. So it's hard to say where he's going to try and take the fight, but he's again one of these fighters that has had a massive career outside the UFC. Fought so many times outside the UFC, got the experience. Debuted against Thiago Moises, ended up getting choked out. Then he got another decision victory in his next fight. Just get absolutely battered and bullied by Steve Garcia, and he's coming off a submission win in his most recent performance. I think Melquizael might be a favourite going into this fight. I'm not sure. He might be an underdog. I don't know what the betting odds are for this fight, but I know a few people are picking Melquizael to win this fight. I'm going Andre Fili. I'm going Fili, the veteran, to win this one by decision. Melquizael hasn't really impressed me in the UFC so far. Andre Fili's a complete veteran. He's coming off a really good win over Cub Swanson, which after UFC Tampa is obviously impressive. But this guy is a veteran of the UFC. He's been in there with the who's who's. And even though he's quite a chinny and chaotic striker, I don't think the guy who's going to find that chin is going to be Melquizael, who has lost half of his fights in the UFC. And even the fights that he's winning, he's having to pull through and face adversity early on in those fights. Like in his most recent win, he was losing the fight up until the stoppage. I'm really not bought on any of the hype from Melquizael. I think Andre Fili is going to completely piece him up on the feet, and I don't think the fight's going to go to the mat in this fight. This is definitely not a layup for Andre Fili, and I can see a key to victory for Melquizael, but I feel like Fili, he's still got it. He's coming off a good win over Cub Swanson. He's only really losing to these good fighters like Dan Ige, who hits like a truck, and Nathaniel Wood, which was a back-and-forth scrap where he actually nearly finished Nathaniel Wood. So I'm going Andre Fili to get the win in this fight. I'm going to pick him to win by decision. Much better striker, much more tested in the UFC, much more experienced, and Melquizael, it isn't even like he's a big prospect. The guy's lost half of his fights in the UFC, and it's not even like he's dominantly putting a stamp on the fights that he is winning. So I'm going Andre Fili by decision. Then we've got Alonzo Menifield again with another short notice fight. It was supposed to be, I think, Umar Sai, who pulled out. And now he's going to be taking on Julius Walker. Alonzo Menifield came into the UFC as a big prospect. A bunch of first-round stoppages coming into the UFC. Gets another first-round stoppage on the Contender Series. I think it was in like 8 seconds as well. Gets another stoppage win in the UFC, followed up by another one where he brutalized Paul Craig. Then he goes on a 2-fight losing streak just to go on a kind of a big tear in the UFC. Ends up losing to William Knight, but apart from that, he's running through every single one of the tests he's given. You know, with some notable wins out there over the likes of Jimmy Cruton, where he absolutely butchered Misha Serkinov in that first round, and obviously that win that he got over Movsarov too. And then he ends up fighting Carlos Ulberg last year, loses in 12 seconds to Carlos Ulberg. He absolutely bum rushed in and then got caught. And then in his most recent fight, got brutally knocked out by Azamat Mirzakhanov, which, to be fair to him, Mirzakhanov's on steroids, but either way, he's on a 2-fight losing streak, both by knockout. Going to be taking on Julius Walker, who, to be fair to him, have nothing but stoppages outside the UFC, undefeated with nothing but stoppages, and that's all there really is to it, really. He's got a bunch of first-round stoppages. I don't really know much about Julius Walker. I've heard good things from Julius Walker. I haven't really seen any of his fights yet, but from what I've been hearing, he seems like a decent prospect outside the UFC. Seems to have a bit of potential, but I'm still going to be picking Alonzo Menifield to win this one by TKO in the second round. I'm not going to say Alonzo Menifield finishes in the first because apparently, like I said, Julius Walker is quite talented. And I feel like we're going to see a bit more of a tentative Alonzo Menifield in this fight. He's just been knocked out in his last 2 fights, both of which were when he was very offensively on the gas. So I think we're going to see a bit more of a calmer approach from Alonzo Menifield, more of a technical approach rather than the usual offensive heavy approach. But I think eventually he's going to clip Julius Walker. Julius is debuting in the UFC after 6 fights against a ranked opponent in Menifield who seems to be very dangerous. I think at some point in the fight, Menifield will clip him with a big shot, get him against the cage, use the experience to clip him with something big, and get the finish over Julius Walker. So I'm going to go Menifield TKO in the second, but I do expect him to be a bit more kind of not on the gas as much in this fight, not as offensively all over the place, not as chaotic, should I say, because he has been knocked out in his last 2, but I'm going to go Menifield by TKO in the second round. And on top of that, it's short notice for Julius Walker. Menifield was supposed to be fighting Umar Sai, and even though I think that was supposed to be for UFC London, he's still been in training camp, preparing for someone much tougher than Walker. So, Menifield, TKO in the second round. Then we've got a really good fight. Gene Silva versus Melsik Baghdasaryan. Now, even though I think Gene Silva should have been getting a ranked opponent after beating Charles Jourdain and Drew Dober back-to-back within 2 weeks, I still think from a, an entertainment perspective, this is quite a good fight. You've obviously got Gene Silva, a massive prospect from the Fighting Nerds. Solid career outside the UFC, comes into the UFC on this huge run of first-round stoppages. Gets a good win on the Contender Series, followed up by a knockout over Weston Wilson, followed up by another knockout over Charles Jourdain, where he was completely piecing him up in that fight. And then just 2 weeks later, he ends up going up a weight class to face Drew Dober and absolutely pieces up Drew Dober in an amazing fight. One of the best fights of 2024. He's going to be taking on Melsik Baghdasaryan, who came from a kickboxing background, so he's a former kickboxer. Then he transitions to MMA, has a bunch of early stoppages in MMA. The first 4 MMA fights he had a combined time of 1 minute and 2 seconds. Gets a good win on the Contender Series, followed up by a 2-fight winning streak. Then that gets submitted by Josh Cutelaba, and then he's back in the winning column with a win over Tucker Lutz in his most recent fight. Even though I know 99% of people are going to be going with Gene Silva because of the name value and the fact that he's such a big prospect, and obviously you should be going with Gene Silva, this could be closer than people think, because I will say about Melsik Baghdasaryan, he is a good striker. He's a solid kickboxer. This is stylistically not an easy fight for Gene Silva. He knows what he's doing on the feet, this Baghdasaryan, but I just think Gene Silva has way more many tools on the feet. He's shown it against much better opponents. He's a much better guy as well than Josh Cutelaba, who finished Melsik Baghdasaryan. And I also think we might see a bit of a grappling approach from Gene Silva. We've seen Gene Silva try to take the fight to the mat before. We saw it when he faced Charles Jourdain. He had offensively grappling style. We saw it against Weston Wilson, and on the Contender Series, Gene Silva likes taking the fight to the mat. And if there's anything about Melsik where he lacks, it is the grappling. He's not a great grappler. Like I said, come from a kickboxing background. He's been submitted in the UFC before. He's been taken down multiple times. So I think we could potentially see a Gene Silva wrestling game plan here. But either way, even if it does stay on the feet, I've got to go with Gene Silva. He knocked out Charles Jourdain. He was piecing up Drew Dober. Melsik, despite being a good striker, has not shown it at all against any top opponents. And I think this is actually a bit of a step down in competition for Gene Silva. I think he gets the decision win. I'm going Gene Silva by decision. And then we have Rob Font taking on Gene Matsumoto, another short notice fight. Obviously, Obviously, Dominic Cruz was supposed to be taking on Rob Font, got injured, retired from the sport, and they've brought in Gene Matsumoto. On short notice, Gene Matsumoto, you look at him outside the UFC, he had a pretty solid career outside the UFC, this massive winning streak, comes over and gets a Contender Series win, followed up by a finish over Dan Argueta, and in his most recent fight went to war with Brad Katona, where he managed to pull off a decision a couple of weeks ago. He's going to be taking on Rob Font. He's also a bit of a veteran at the UFC. He's been in the UFC for absolutely ages. He debuted in the UFC all the way back in 2014. So similar to like Andre Fili, he's been in the UFC for ages. He had a pretty solid start to his UFC career. He was a much different kind of striker back then. A much more kind of chaotic striker with a bunch of stoppages. He had a very offensive, heavy style in his early UFC career. And then eventually, after taking a couple of losses, he ended up going on a bit of a tear. Well, not a bit of a tear, but he ended up going on a bit of a winning streak. Beat Sergio Pettis, beat Ricky Simon, ended up knocking out Marlon Moraes. Then he fights in a fight night main event against former champion Cody Garbrandt. Beats Cody Garbrandt in his biggest win. And since then, he's kind of been on a bit of a downward slope. He's lost the vast majority of his recent fights. He's fought in 3 fight night main events and 1 core main event, and he's lost every single one of them. Although he has fraud checked another prospect in Adrian Yanez, where he completely knocked him out. And he also managed to get a really good win over Kyler Phillips in his most recent fight. So I think Gene Matsumoto might be a favourite going into this, or the odds are very close. But I feel like if you're picking Gene Matsumoto to win this fight, you're simply picking him because he's this Brazilian undefeated prospect who's going to be taking on the old veteran in Rob Font. But if you actually watch their fights, I think Rob Font wins this one comfortably. I'm going Rob Font by decision. I actually even considered picking Rob Font to win this one by knockout. Gene Matsumoto, he's got this kind of chaotic striking style, but this guy went life and death with Brad Katona. Brad Katona is not a good fighter, and he went life and death with that guy, getting caught multiple times, and you're putting him against a seasoned, polished boxer in Rob Font, who I'm going to go out there and say is one of the best boxers, just pure boxers right now in the bantamweight division. I think this could end really badly for Matsumoto. I think Rob Font, who looked really good against Kyler Phillips, is going to absolutely piece up Gene Matsumoto. Matsumoto, unless he takes the fight to the mat, which I don't think he's going to do because Rob Font has a decent takedown defense, I think Rob Font keeps the fight standing and just completely outboxes him for the majority of the fight. And like I said before, I wouldn't be surprised if he gets the stoppage because Gene Matsumoto, he just had a war with Brad Katona. He got hit about 100,000 times. He put him against Rob Font. The last time we saw an offensive striker against Rob Font in Adrian Yanez, he ended up getting put to sleep in the very first round. So I think Rob Font could easily catch Matsumoto in this fight, but I think overall he's going to piece him up and get the decision win. I'm going Rob Font to win this one by decision. And then we have the co-main event. We've got Brendan Allen, after he's lost to Nasruddin Imavov, taking on the next big thing in the middleweight division, the dark horse of the middleweight division in Anthony Hernandez. Now, these guys have actually fought before, all the way, I don't know what promotion it was on, but they've actually fought before where Anthony Hernandez was able to get a decision win. But anyway, Brendan Allen, the guy's had a pretty up and down career outside the UFC. Nothing notable apart from, like I said, the fight with Anthony Hernandez. He also ended up fighting Eric Anders and Trevin Giles outside the UFC, which was also his other losses outside the UFC. So he's only really lost to UFC fighters outside the UFC. Managed to become LFA champion, gets a good stoppage on the Contender Series, gets a 3-fight winning streak, gets absolutely destroyed by Sean Strickland, then goes on a 2-fight winning streak, then gets knocked out by Chris Curtis, and then he goes on a bit of a run in the UFC. A lot of rear naked choke stoppages, fights in a couple of fight night main events against Paul Craig and Chris Curtis where he pulls through, but in his most recent fight, he got kind of battered by Nasruddin Imavov in the second and the third round. He's going to be taking on Anthony Hernandez, who had, like I said, a solid start to his MMA career. Nothing but stoppages with a win over Brendan Allen. Gets a good win on the Contender Series, which actually ended up being a no contest because he took marijuana. Then he goes 1-2 in his next fights in the UFC. It looks like he's about to get cut from the UFC after he lost to Kevin Holland, but then he's been on a tear since then with a bunch of stoppages with some really impressive wins, like the submission win over Rodolfo Vieira when he was a massive underdog going in there with the big jiu-jitsu prospect of Rodolfo Vieira, and he submits him, submitting the next big thing in the middleweight division where he submitted Roman Kopylov at UFC 298, and he just fought in a fight night main event against Michel Pereira and absolutely mauled him. It was like watching prime Cain Velasquez all over again. Took him down and mauled him every single round and got the stoppage in the 5th. I'm going Hernandez to win this one by decision. I feel like Anthony Hernandez is what Brendan Allen thinks he is. That's the best way I can describe this fight. Anthony Hernandez, I think he mauls him in this fight. Like I said, he's got this kind of relentless mauling grappling style. Reminds me a lot of like a mix of Khabib and Cain Velasquez, where he's just constantly on you, smothering you with the grappling, and then eventually he'll find the stoppage. And Brendan Allen, he's got good jiu-jitsu, I'll give him that, but the guy did not impress me in that fight with Nasruddin Imavov. There was times in the fight where Imavov was doing the better with the grappling, and on the feet, Allen has absolutely nothing. He's also, his takedown entries are nowhere near as clean as Anthony Hernandez, so I'm going Hernandez by decision. I think he's really good in the middleweight division. I think he's a top 8 fighter, at least in the UFC's Hernandez. He just mauled Michel Pereira. He mauled Roman Kopylov. And even though this could be a bad fight for Hernandez because of the jiu-jitsu of Brendan Allen, you've got two grapplers going against each other, I really don't think that matters. We've seen him against grapplers before when he faced Rodolfo Vieira and he was able to wear him out. And Brendan Allen was fading in that fight with Imavov too. Anthony Hernandez is the type of guy to wear you out. I think Allen gets absolutely worn out in this fight, out-grappled and just kind of mauled by Anthony Hernandez. I'm going Hernandez to win this one by decision, and hopefully from there, we can see a big fight for Hernandez. Somebody in the top 5, maybe like a Robert Whittaker would be a good fight after that. So I'm going Hernandez, fluff it to win this one by decision. Then we've got the main event, Henry Cejudo returning to the octagon to take on Song Yadong. I don't need to introduce you to Cejudo, you know, former Olympic gold medalist in wrestling, comes over to MMA, has a solid MMA career start, has a solid start to his UFC career with 4 straight wins, ends up losing to Demetrius Johnson and Joseph Benavidez, then goes on a 2-fight winning streak, followed up by a title win over Demetrius Johnson, followed up by a finishing defense over TJ Dillashaw, followed up by a double champ win when he beat Marlon Moraes, and then he finishes Dominic Cruz for his another title defense on his name. Then he decides to retire in his prime, which might be one of the worst decisions in MMA history. Comes back 3 years later to fight for the belt against Aljamain Sterling, loses by decision, and then gets embarrassed in his most recent fight when he lost to Merab Dvalishvili about a year ago from now. He's going to be taking on Song Yadong, who didn't really have a great start to his MMA career. I mean, if we're talking in terms of UFC main eventers, he lost a lot of fights outside the UFC, comes over to the UFC, goes on a bit of a winning streak, though, with some good wins over the likes of Marlon Vera, loses a close fight to Kyler Phillips, then goes on another 3-fight winning streak with 2 stoppages, loses to Corey Sandhagen, but that was due to a doctor stoppage, then goes on a 2-fight winning streak, and then in his most recent fight, loses a decision to Peter Yan. This is a tough fight to pick. I think Song Yadong might be the favourite, but it's a tough one to pick in this fight because if anybody's going to get a stoppage, it's going to be Song Yadong by knockout over the old guy, Henry Cejudo, who's come back and lost twice. But I feel like Cejudo could pull this one through. The fact that it's 5 rounds gives me hope for Cejudo because I really do feel like Cejudo could go 5 rounds. He showed that in the fight with Aljamain Sterling, where he looked all right in the 4th round. And Song Yadong was faded in that fight with Peter Yan. And also in that fight with Peter Yan, I'm still not entirely sure of the wrestling of Song Yadong. Like, he was getting out wrestled by Peter Yan. And I know Yan's not a bad wrestler. If anything, he's an underrated wrestler. But I'm really not entirely sure about the grappling of Song Yadong. And you put him against Cejudo, who, even though he's not one of the elite wrestlers of the division like a Merab or Numan Magomedov, still obviously has the wrestling accolades, even though he might not be fully acclimatized to the MMA wrestling side of things and he's mainly just an Olympic wrestler. Still think the wrestling of Cejudo could bring a lot of problems to Song Yadong. I think if he has this kind of grappling heavy style early on, he could potentially penalize the grappling of Song Yadong, take him to the mat, keep the fight on the mat. And I think as the fight goes on, that's only going to, in my opinion, be better for Henry Cejudo. He's been 5 rounds multiple times. Like I said, in that fight with Aljamain Sterling, he didn't look too bad. Obviously, he's a former champion as well, so he's been the distance a few times as well. And Song Yadong, like I said, faded in that fight with PT, and after the 1st round, he wasn't looking as sharp. So I'm going to go with Cejudo by decision. Bit of a gamble. I know Song Yadong is definitely the more dangerous guy. He's the younger guy. And if you are a betting man, I wouldn't recommend betting on this fight. But I think Cejudo pulls through. I'm going Cejudo to win a decision. I still think he's a top bantamweight. And even though he lost to Merab and Aljamain Sterling, they were the best in the UFC bantamweight division at the time. Sterling was the champion. Merab's now obviously the dominant champion. And Song Yadong, he hasn't really fought any of the elite. I mean, he's fought Peter Yan and Sandhagen, lost to both of them. But apart from that, he hasn't fought like a champion contender yet. But yeah, I'm going Cejudo to win this one by decision. But those are my picks and predictions for UFC Seattle. Let me know your thoughts on this card and the predictions if you agree or disagree. And thank you for watching.